Great. Hi, everyone. Welcome to the seminar on the road to Paris, understanding the new financial pact. It's been a really popular issue. Lots of people have signed up for this. We have something over 260 people interested in this discussion, which is fantastic. My name is Cal Cura. I work with What Will Strategy and What Will Assembly, helping people get together on global advocacy work across the issues. And I'm pleased to help facilitate and organize this, working with Federica Roeder, the Vice President for Global Advocacy at Global Citizen. As I said to those who had joined previously, we are recording this event. We will be having an initial, just a quick introduction and welcome, then moving to 10 to 15 minutes of presentation from Federica, and then having a Q&A for the majority of our hour session. The Q&A will happen in the chat, so if you think of some ideas or some questions when Federica is giving a presentation, pop them into the chat, and we'll come back to you when we open the Q&A. I ask everyone to keep themselves muted while the conversation's happening. Obviously, if there's a good flow and we can have people come and ask questions on video, we'll do so. If we have a lot of questions, we'll just have to keep it to the chat because we won't have the time to go back and forth. So I hope you appreciate that. Without further ado, let's kick off and move over to Federica. Fantastic. You can take the time, Federica, share us what you're hearing in Paris, give some updates on where we think the meeting is going, and then where is it advocacy happening and how can we all help turn this really interesting event into something substantial around financing for development and climate. So over to you, Federica.
Thank you so much, Cal. Hi, everyone. It's great to see so much interest in this. And we hope you would find this briefing and discussion useful. We actually realized with Cal, but also a few other partners, that we have this opportunity coming up with the Paris Financing Summit. But so far, there's barely any information out there. And also that while there are already a few coordination groups, they're actually limited to just a small number of organizations and countries. So this is why we wanted to set up this call, and rather quickly than later, because we don't actually have that much time up to the summit. So the idea is really that we want to share what we already know about the summit, how we feel that it is an opportunity that we could leverage. And hopefully this is then also the first step to building a broader coalition and working closely on making sure that the summit in June, but then also the process beyond delivers. So I'm now going to try to share my presentation. Just a few slides, don't worry. So I hope you can now all see it. Yes, great. Let's start with a quote by President Macron. We need a big shock of concessional financing. All the middle income countries, some emerging ones, the poorest countries, they have all seen us, the richest countries, during the pandemic. We faced all the same shock in a symmetric way, and we did exceptional things. Back then, we mobilized exceptional financial resources. And they tell us, but what is happening to us is exceptional. The end of water on our soil, the radical changes which make our life impossible. And now you tell us that we go back to business as usual. They are right, we cannot continue to do business as usual. So this is a translation I made. This is why it might not sound that fluid. But I went back to actually the COP27 speech. So back at COP27, Emmanuel Macron had a bilateral meeting with Mia Mottley. And they discussed exactly this, that during the pandemic, at least some countries, the most wealthy countries, were able to mobilize exceptional means in terms of financing. But other countries could not do so. And also we're not necessarily able to do it for other issues than what we were able to do in a short time span. After Sharm el-Sheikh, he flew to the G20 in Bali, and this is where he did announce the Paris Financing Summit. More precisely, he actually said that he wanted to organize a summit for a new Global Financing Pact. And the underlying thinking is that the current multilateral system, especially the global financial system, is failing to many countries and not responding to their needs. This applies to countries like Barbados, but has a high GDP, but is extremely vulnerable to climate change or to external shocks in general. But of course, also to the least developed countries and those that are already in debt distress. The other problem that he identified, and obviously others as well, is that the system we have today is basically no longer fit for purpose, neither for poverty reduction nor for climate change. And then I think another issue that came through in his speeches, but also in the discussions with the French government since then, is also the need to actually be able to mobilize financing at scale, but in a way that is, let's say, more sustainable than what we are able to mobilize today, where we can have surges, for instance, during the pandemic, but then financing can drop also very quickly because of other political reasons, especially, of course, the ODA budget that is being mobilized through the national budgets. And then obviously what also came in is, and you probably, a lot of you followed this discussion also at COP27, the need to have more countries contribute financially to multilateral action, especially countries that have the means to do so, such as Gulf countries. And you see that a lot of this thinking resonates with what Mia Mottley has already formulated since some time. And you know that she's maybe the instigator of the Bridgetown Agenda, which is an agenda to radically reform the global financial system. And this is not just to mobilize more financing, let's say, for specific needs that Barbados might face, but really the idea of constructing a new global deal, a new social impact compact. And a lot of the issues that Mia Mottley and others as well, of course, raised, like reforming the World Bank, how to use special drawing rights, specific financial asset from the IMF in a more effective way, how to find financing at scale for the green energy transitions. These are all things that we will also see are likely to be on the agenda for this Paris summit. So what do we know so far? Most importantly, maybe the date. So the summit is now set for the 22nd and the 23rd in Paris. It's a summit, so it should be head of states and government level as much as possible. And I said G20 plus, so the G20 will of course be invited, but also countries that are not part of the G20, like more African countries, for instance, probably also more European countries. We don't have the exact invitation list yet. And we know since 2 weeks or so that the summit will be co-chaired with India, India being the only official co-chair, but other countries such as Barbados will obviously play a key role. What is maybe also interesting to note, it's a summit, it's closely linked to the G20, now of course also through the co-chairing with India, but it's a summit that doesn't really have a format, like there's no process yet, there's no Sherpa process or anything, which is obviously also an opportunity, especially for civil society, to ensure that it's, for instance, not closed door, but can also include non-state actors. The focus is, as I already said, the reform of the global financial system to deliver more resources for both climate and poverty reduction, and to make sure that these resources are protected even in case of external shocks, so that especially when we actually have an external shock, those resources can be available and are not being diminished. And also to have a system that is fair in addressing the needs of all countries and not just a few. In terms of outcomes, what we're hearing is that there would likely be a political declaration signed by all the participating countries. One outcome could also be the launch of longer-term reform processes, especially those that don't have a home yet in the global architecture. So to give you one example, is the use or the introduction of international solidarity taxes. This is not yet, for instance, at the G20 agenda, but the summit could basically launch a process of itself around this issue. And then action coalitions, so more specific deliverables that would trigger immediate action, but are not necessarily endorsed by all participants. And while the summit, as I said, is a little bit a summit that falls out outside of the existing processes, it should be viewed as part of a longer timeline. I mean, this is also how the French government is portraying it, and I think we have an interest in doing so, because a summit, a standalone summit itself can obviously deliver less than something that is part of a sequence of moments, of action forcing moments, political decision moments. So the next one is the spring meetings in April, of course. Then the G7 summit in May, which sometimes mentioned, sometimes not when we discuss it, but still obviously an important meeting where heads of states, especially of the most important donor countries, come together. Then there is the summit in Paris, the G20 summit, early September this year. It's earlier than the previous years. The UN General Assembly, the annual meetings, and then the COP28. And that's obviously a very, a sequence that is, that means that quite regularly we have action forcing moments. We have also one more summit, which will hopefully help to maintain a momentum, but also push decisions through in Paris and beyond. So there's no there's no preset meeting schedule or anything for the summit, just because it has never been organized like this. So far they've set up a structure of different groups. The most important one being the steering committee, which will include, most importantly, some of the key countries. I mean, India, of course, Barbados. We're also hearing Germany, UK, US, Senegal, the EU Commission, and also the heads of the international financial institutions and the UN. But the final membership has not been published yet. They promised to share it with us, but I think they are still discussing this with India. But this is probably the key group that is going to negotiate the outcomes. They should be probably seen as Sherpas. Then there will be 4 working groups, which will include mainly also government representatives, but not only. Number 1 being ensuring more fiscal space for the most affected countries. What we're hearing here is that this should, I'm just checking, yeah, you have it, that this should include issues like the MDB reform, debt clauses, SDRs, and will include representatives of different treasuries. Sorry. The next one is financing the private sector in low-income countries. Here there are a lot of ideas floating around. We're hearing sovereign wealth funds, private sector instruments of multilateral development banks, potentially carbon markets. Third one is increasing investment in green infrastructures in emerging and developing markets, which is basically about how to fund the just energy transition plans longer term, in a more systematic way than what's possible today. And number 4 is developing innovative solutions to provide additional resources in support of countries vulnerable to climate change. I mean, it says vulnerable to climate change, but in discussions, what we heard, this is also basically the highly concessional financing for least developed countries. And this is where For instance, taxes could be discussed, and also insurance-based mechanisms. And we are also, they want to communicate like the final membership of these working groups, but we don't have them yet. And probably they will invite experts and also civil society representatives for specific sessions when they digging into one of the specific issues. And then there's a high-level group of economists, which kind of sits a little bit outside of this structure, and they can feed in any ideas they want. This is basically a continuation of a group of economists that already existed from the One Planet Summit process. So what's actually on the agenda, or maybe not? I think a lot is actually still open, and so this is obviously great because it means we can influence it. So one, and probably the objective Macron has mentioned most is the target to achieve a reallocation of special drawing rights of 100 billion. This is a G20 commitment that they took already 1.5 years ago, but they're still around 35 billion short of it. So the question is, can they get to the 100 billion by June? I put this in yellow saying it's not yet done, but at least it's on their radar. The 100 billion in climate financing. So this is the Copenhagen target from 2009 that they should have met in 2020. So this is something that Macron specifically mentioned when he spoke at COP. It obviously makes sense for them to close the remaining like 16 billion gap or so. Also to show that they are actually following through on old commitments before taking new ones. But to be honest, I think this is one where there needs to be much more pushing to making sure that it's indeed on the agenda. Then the reform of the MDBs. This is an overarching theme. The question here is, what can Paris exactly deliver, given that this is obviously also something that will be discussed at the spring meetings, that is also firmly on the G20 agenda. So probably easier to tell after the spring meetings, depending on what's possible up to the spring meetings. Also, they are hoping that the new World Bank president will join in Paris. The natural disaster and pandemic clauses for new debt contracts. So these are the clauses that Mia Motley also advocates for, which actually would suspend debt repayments in case there is a natural disaster that hits or a new pandemic. So they are already actively working on putting a coalition together on this one. Mechanisms to address the existing debt stock. So the natural disaster and pandemic clauses would only apply to future debt contracts. And the question is, what do we do with the current debt stock, especially of some least developed countries? So they have this somehow on the radar, but it's clearly something where I think civil society can play a role in pushing specific proposals. Then I mentioned the tax. So they are basically saying that, as I said in the beginning, they are looking for this concessional shock. Some of the financing would obviously come from MDB reform and so on, but they're also very clear that this is not enough. France already has 2 taxes that are earmarked for development and climate, the airplane levy and the financial transaction tax. They are willing to consider different options. You know that Mia Motley, for instance, is pushing for a fossil fuel tax. Again, I think that this is a difficult one, a stretch goal where it will probably be difficult to build coalitions, but at the same time where the summit is a real opportunity because this issue otherwise is not being discussed in any of the global policy forums. The private sector definitely on the agenda, but what exactly it's still very much of a question mark. Then the mitigation trust fund. So this is again an idea that comes from the Bridgetown agenda. The idea basically being to leverage central banks and to mobilize way more capital than ever before on capital on private markets to fund the green energy transition. It could be basically mean a step change in terms of financing of the green energy transition. It's a longer term project, but it could be kicked off in Paris. We're not hearing any pushback, but again, I don't think it's something that will happen automatically unless we push for it. And then the big question mark is around ODA, and I would say maybe more specifically the IDA replenishment, because they do say, yes, we need much more highly concessional resources for the least developed countries, and especially for issues like health and education. But unless they are able to kick off a coalition around a specific tax, it's not entirely clear where this funding would come from and to what extent they will use the summit also to defend international commitments like the 0.7 ODA target. There could be obviously other things that I think we could push onto the agenda, because at the moment the discussions are really quite open and the working groups have this mandate to crowdsource ideas. But these are maybe the ones that come up most in discussions, and some of them have already been mentioned publicly. Last but not least, nothing, as I said, of this will happen without civil society pushing for it. Clearly, Macron and also Motley, of course, and others are quite ambitious, but the timeline is short, and we know that it would be very difficult to actually build coalitions. So there is always a risk that the summit will just end up to be a talk shop. So in order to avoid this, and this is also why we really wanted to host this call, is we feel that we need a wide coalition across different groups, different types of groups, and different countries and regions. And we have put up some proposals here of how we could keep in contact and maybe coordinate in the months to come up to Paris, but maybe also beyond. So one is there's already a WhatsApp group that we can share the link so that you can join, which is basically to share intel nearly on a daily basis. There's already one policy brief that some of us worked on, and it's open for co-signature. Some partners are hosting regional calls. So there's, for instance, a European G7 one, but also in Asia one and others that you can join if you're interested in becoming more active on this. And then we also set up a Google Drive to be able to share some of the documents. I'll stop here and say thank you. And hopefully we can make something happen in Paris in June.
Excellent. That's fantastic. Thank you very much, Friederike, for that comprehensive overview of the summit and giving an idea. Because I think a lot of people who know of the summit know it's building up the importance of the summit in terms of the financing and the scope of actions for 2023, but didn't have that context and that level of detail, which is fantastic. So we want to move over to Q&As into this next session. We have roughly 35 minutes to really get deep and ask some questions. So what we're going to do is we're going to go from the chat. We won't do hands up because we are going to go from chats to make sure, because there's so many people asking questions. To kick off with, we have Dr. Nora from Ergowal asking, how are the other regions like Asia and the financial institutions like the AIIB and the ADB included in this process? Do you want to address that one very quickly, Friederike?
Sorry, this is in the chat?
Yeah, it's gone back. It's further up there a little bit. But basically, how are the other financial institutions from Asia being involved in this? Is this open to all the MDBs? How are they playing a role?
That's a very good question. So we heard that the head of the World Bank and the head of the IMF would be part of the steering committee. And we know that there are discussions also with the African Development Bank, but we don't know more. Hopefully they would be included in some of the working groups, but maybe this is one thing that we can also actually raise with the French government next time we have a meeting.
Great, thanks for that. And just on that, how is the participants from the LDCs coming through, and do you think they'll be representing the conference? And that's coming from Carolee Moonley at everyone.
Yeah, this is extremely important. Initially, we saw that in the steering committee, they only included one LDC, Senegal, and only one African country for that matter. And we've pushed this quite hard in different meetings, and they now told us that LDCs should be part of all of the working groups, but we don't know which ones yet. And they were also looking and having more African participation in the steering committee. But I think, regardless of what they're doing in terms of like the formal participation, I think this is actually a very important point that we need to constantly make, that the summit should deliver, obviously, for countries that are, for instance, particularly climate vulnerable and so on, but also find solutions for the least developed countries that are already in high debt distress. So this was also my point, that it's great if they are looking at the natural disaster clauses, and this is very important for future debt contracts. But the reality is that a lot of countries won't be able to sign any new debt contracts unless we find a solution to their existing debt stock. So I think this is something where we need to continue making this point.
Great. And then Heikki from Ergowal asked to comment on how it is important to point out there's no discussion on how to restrict public financial flow to fossil fuels, like stopping tax breaks and other investment incentives, including all the grey finance pathways, which climate finance itself is part of such as being used to bail out the uneconomical coal plants, JETP, and 100 million in 2023. World Bank budget finance in Barbados is also partly being used to lure investments to new offshore oil. Any comments on that?
Yeah, of course. So it's true that when we talk about MDB reform, it's obviously such a broad term. And I'm going to share also the links to the policy brief we worked on, and I know other partners have similar recommendations and position papers. The idea being to, on the one hand, ensure that the MDBs, to say it in a nutshell, but for them to take more risk and leverage their balance sheet more, but at the same time, obviously making sure that they're using this financing in the right way. So, for instance, not for fossil fuel investments, but for investments into renewable energy. So it's really let's say the two tracks that need to go together. And this is also a concern that we had raised with the French government and actually also others, that these really need to go hand in hand. But I think, again, this is, they did receive this well and agreed that Paris alignment is extremely important. But again, I think this is something we need to be vigilant and need to continue making the case for. Great. A couple of questions are coming in on some of the how to join the different working groups and the WhatsApp. We'll come to that at the end of the call at the next step, so bear with us, we'll get to that. But as the questions have slowed down a bit, I want to go back to raising hands. And I know Tracy from Greenpeace, you had your hand up. I wonder if you would want to come and share your question live with us.
Sure, happy to do that. Thank you for inviting me to do so. So yeah, Tracy from Greenpeace. I had two questions. One is just the status of who's hosting the summit. So originally we were referring to it as a Macron summit. Then it seemed Mia Mottley was closely involved. So the Macron-Mottley summit. Now I understand Modi also has some kind of formal role. Is this now the Macron-Modi summit? Anyway, any insights on that would be great. The other question on solidarity finance, I just wanted to double check, is the scope of that just covering climate, or are they also thinking in terms of other development objectives, health, education, whatever? Thank you.
So the only official co-chair now is going to be Modi. So if we want to give it a name, it should be probably Macron-Modi Summit. We call it Paris Financing Summit because countries like Barbados and Motley will play a big role, and we really hope also that there would be a few African champions joining this, let's say, core group, such as maybe Ruto, given that he's also hosting a summit in September. In terms of the focus, this is something where we also had questions, but they clarified it, and now there's also a concept note setting this out. The focus is clearly to mobilize financing and different types of financing for climate, but also for poverty reduction, and I would say in particular health and education.
Great. And then Camilo, do you have a question on biodiversity? Do you want to ask that live, or are you happy with that to be in the chat?
Thank you. Well, maybe just to expand a little bit on that. We've been seeing that the biodiversity agenda has been falling behind the climate one, and just making sure that maybe we could agree upon using this platform also to include the biodiversity post-2020 global framework as an objective to work upon, and just to discuss this using this platform. Thank you.
Do you want to come back on that, Frederica?
No, agreed. It's an important one. And I think what would be great, Camilo, if you actually even have more specific proposals on what exactly is, I mean, how Paris can help, like, maintain a focus on this agenda.
Great. A previous question, at the very start, from Kathy from Citizens Lobby asked, you know, how important is the Marrakesh meeting of the World Bank? Is that going to be seen as a key moment later on in the year, given its timing? What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think Marrakesh, just as the spring meetings as well, is probably going to be a key moment on everything around the MDB reform, and possibly also debt. I think at this stage, so we have the spring meetings, right? Then we have the Paris Financing Summit, and then I think in July there is the third G20 Finance Ministerial. I would say that at the moment, at least on our side, we're very much focusing on these different moments, hoping that a lot can be delivered before or by the G20 summit. But otherwise, we have the annual meetings, which will probably also help to make progress where we weren't able to make progress beforehand.
Great. Did that answer the question, Kathy?
Yes, it did. And then I had another question, if I may.
Sure.
I'm just following up to the biodiversity question, and I was at the UN Biodiversity COP. So I'm just, it's not just biodiversity and climate, there's also human rights and gender equity issues that we need to also be considering, not to be Captain Obvious or anything, but I just wanted to pipe in and say that too, please.
No problem. And Joe's asking from NRDC whether or not, what's the story behind Motley no longer being co-chair, or was she ever co-chair?
No, she never was. There was never another formal co-chair, and they had said right from the beginning that they really wanted to have India on board because of this close connection with the G20. And I think the idea also being that they probably didn't want to have too many co-chairs, but I think also this idea that, yes, it's partly at least Motley's agenda, but also to make sure that it's more widely shared and not seen just as a Bridgetown summit.
Great. A couple more questions, but just say if there's French colleagues on the call that know what's happening in terms of mobilization in France, so if you want to come on and share some of the thoughts and plans around that, that'd be fantastic. We'll take a couple more questions, but just let me know in the chat if you'd like to do so. Mark, Pascal, do you want to come online and ask your question?
Yes, thanks, Gal. You mentioned earlier, Frederica, that this will not happen without civil society, so that got me curious as to whether there have been talks about any formal space for civil society to engage during or even before the summit. Will we be allowed to participate in the summit itself, or is it generally exclusive for states?
Do you want to add?
Yeah, I mean, this is very much what we're pushing for. We think that given that this is not a G7, G20, whatever summit, that they actually have the liberty to do something else out of it. And they are thinking about it, how, for instance, civil society could be part of it. So far what we're hearing is that especially day number 1 could be more civil society focused. What we said, and it would be interesting also to hear ideas from you, is that we were saying, okay, great, if we can be somehow part on the summit day, but ideally, obviously, we're part of the process early on, because we know that, I mean, everything will be prepared beforehand. So this is where they came back to us and said that civil society representatives, especially with more of an expert profile, could be invited into the working groups. And also they are happy to receive any like written submissions. And then we also asked them whether we could already have some sort of civil society representation at the first steering committee, but haven't heard back on that one. But there might be other possibilities, such as asking them, for instance, to actually publish drafts of the political declaration online. And yeah, I'd be curious also to hear other ideas of how they could meaningfully, let's say, have us participate early onwards in the process.
Okay, I'm going to take a couple questions SDR, and I see some hands up from Marwin and then from Andreas. Then I think we'll just stop there for questions and just ask for other people working the summit, especially some French colleagues as well. So there's 3 which I'll cluster together from Heather, Carly, and Can UK, saying, are there focus themes coming up for the SDR allocations, such as education? And also in SDR, do we have a sense of whether something like a new special allocation might be on the table, or is it just achieving the 100 billion recycled? And the final part, Barbados has been talking a lot about MTF specifically for SDRs. I think we need to be clear that we do not want important democratic institutions like the GCF pushed out and marginalized by any new proposals or non-democratic institutions. There's a bit of a chat going on within that, which is great. Any initial responses to that? And then we'll go to 2 more questions. And define MTF.
Shall I come in now, Kel?
Yes, please.
Yeah. Okay. So on the SDRs, for the time being, the focus is on achieving the 100 billion reallocation, not a new issuance, as this is felt to be unrealistic in the short term with the US. And in terms of the sectors, I mean, there's some discussion, you know, like the SDRs can be reallocated through the PRGT and through the RST at the World Bank. And especially the RST has a climate, but also health focus. On education, to be honest, I think that should probably be more the pre-RGT, but maybe colleagues here can say more on this. But there's also discussions about using the SDRs for regional development banks like the African Development Bank. And this is something that France very much supports, but for legal reasons cannot do themselves. On the MTF, so the MTF, yes, so this is an idea, the Mitigation Trust Fund. It's an idea that emanated from Barbados and Nia Motley's advisor, Avinash Persaud. The idea being here to use a new issuance of SDRs and basically the backing, if I could call it like this, of central banks to leverage capital at an unprecedented scale on private markets to invest it in the green energy transition. I think there are already like initial proposals. I believe, and I don't know whether they're on here, but otherwise we can follow up, that colleagues from E3G are working on something more specific. This is also why we said it's rather a long-term project, because it would really, I mean, the idea would really to have a step change in terms of financing available for instance, the just energy transition deals and so on. and also to look into alternatives of, is there something else that can be used than SDRs? Because we know that probably in next couple or maybe more years, it will be very difficult to get another issuance of SDR. So it might be good to kind of work different options out. And I don't think that it's one or the other. I think that the GCF, for instance, would still play an important role. But as I said, it's a very initial idea. Stopping here.
Okay.
I hope I answered all the questions.
Well, they can do. Please follow up in the chat if you have further information needed. So we're going to put cluster Marwan and Andreas, and then so do you want to go for it, Marwan?
Sure, and thank you. Sorry for going totally meta here, but this seems to me like adding an informal to the informal. I mean, let's not forget, G7 and G20 are, if you want, informal processes in the sense that nothing that is promised there, you know, if it's not taken, tough luck. Now, I'm just wondering if this is, you know, we all know that it's like 12 big donors that fund everything that has to do with either development or humanitarian aid. And in the world so far, the big middle income countries that could really cough up some stuff that goes towards ODA, it's just not happening, and they have happily resisted for many years to do so. Would you think that this is another way of putting kind of somehow moral pressure on getting some of these countries that could give but won't give, bring them into the fold in a more informal way? You know, sorry for going so meta, but when I saw this is nicely bracketed, the timeline was starts with the spring meetings, goes off, then ends with UNGA, and in between we have all the G7, G20s, and wonderful, and another summit. It just smells to me like there is another desperate attempt to bring some people in, you know, some countries into the fold that just don't want to participate in a global family of solidarity. And I thought this solidarity tax thing really kind of pulled the curtain from that. Just a feeling that I have. And if I'm going too meta, just ignore me, you know.
We can never ignore you, Marwan. Andreas, do you want to come in?
Yeah, thanks very much for this, and also thanks for allowing more of a discussion with people coming in and speaking. I'm Andreas with Can International, which is a network of around 2,000 environmental organizations. So just to say, we come of a big network-wide strategy retreat where we made this one of our priorities, and our network will coordinate around this very much this year as well. I wanna say agree very much that we need to look at the pushes we need to do and what Marvin said, but I think there's so much to be unpacked, right, in terms of political strategy. So it would be good to be somewhat coordinated, because I would have a lot of comments on all the nitty-gritty you kindly laid out. I'll refrain from here. So I have one question and one comment basically on top of that. First, how would you then suggest we can coordinate going forward? Because we will very much coordinate with our member organizations going forward. And secondly, in terms of, I think there was a question you raised, Friederike, with regards to civil society participation and the summit, how that can be improved. I think from what we heard so far, the unclarity made us a little worried. Also in terms of the concept, how civil society is included along the way. We heard that, for instance, only one civil society representative should be in each of the working groups. We find this is not sufficient given the broadness of the topic, given there are various groups that don't have a natural way of coordinating with each other. So I think from our end, the first thought we had was to come back and say, look, there needs to be better and more representation in these groups, potentially also in the steering group. So just yeah, the question around coordination and the comment around that participation, and wondering if that can be a kind of a more forceful and stronger demand that is certainly helpful if it comes from yeah, multiple corners. Thanks very much. Over.
Great. Do you want to come back on any of those points there, Friederike?
Yes, thank you, Cal. So Andreas, yeah, very much agree with you. Also because they're looking for more expert profiles from civil society, which I understand, but it's a bit difficult to find the, in French, we would say the sheep with 5 legs. So it could probably be more useful to have a group of civil society engaging with each working group so that they can then draw on specific, competencies for each issue they want to dig into. So I think we need to follow up with them on that one. Marvin, yeah, to also agree, this is definitely, I mean, I don't know whether it's desperate, but it's definitely an attempt to draw in more countries in terms of global responsibilities. They did mention particularly, for instance, the Gulf states. Also, obviously, the US came up a lot on both 100 billion targets, so 100 billion in climate financing and 100 billion in SDRs. And here, I think what we're trying to do is, yes, of course, I mean, we're definitely in for everyone participating, but at the same time, let's say some countries not doing their fair share should not be an excuse, for instance, for European countries not to do more. So for instance, on both targets, we're proposing pathways to reach the targets without the US, for instance. And at the same time, we're obviously continuing to do whatever is possible on the US side. And my colleague Filmona is actually also on the call for anyone who wants to discuss, let's say, the specific challenges on the US side. In terms of how we can continue to work together, Cal, do you already, or are we doing this at the very end, or?
Yeah, I thought we'd come into the last 5 minutes to share sort of the next steps. One thing in the chat, I thought was an important question, which I'd like to capture. I'm going to ask the question and answer it because someone did that in the chat, but capture it for the recording, is just to figure out if there's other groups coming in to help organize this from their donors. And then Hugh from Welcome Trust said that we hear the steering committee is France, Barbados, UAE, USA, China, EC, Germany, UK, South Africa, the IMF, UN, World Bank, OECD. And then we've heard, then Friederike added that there might be a few more added to that. So just to capture that for the recording. Is there any other colleagues from France who would like to share some of the idea what's happening on the ground there in the lead up? Is there anybody who wants to sort of take the floor? I know Julianne from Amnesty France has just put something in the chat. Kiara, do you want to come in on this? You've been volunteered. Going once, twice. So no, okay. So let's go back to the questions. And John, you've asked a very detailed, Julianne, you come on board. Do you want to share some ideas?
Yeah, sorry. Hi, everyone. I would like to say that we just begin to work on it, and we do not have the expertise yet to talk more about the issues about the summit, but we will have a meeting about it with colleagues from Amnesty International UK. So we will talk more about it later on.
Okay, great. And Andreas, you have your hand up?
Yeah, apologies to come back in. And I'm not from France, but to say, I think I fully agree regarding the need to work closely with our French colleagues, and we also do so. I think also just as a reflection for me from this call, and also looking at the summit, and for instance, the expert we've seen so far on the expert committees, I think representation from those parts of the world that are in fact most affected by the climate crisis and by these by a lot of the policies around debt and justice, I think is something we really should take into account. So I just wanted to very strongly make that comment for us going forward. Also, when we look into engagement at the summit itself, that we're taking humble steps towards that. Thanks.
Great. Guillaume from Oxfam, France, do you want to come in?
Yeah, hi everyone, and thanks Federica and Kel for organizing this call. So we've been working closely with Federica, Global Citizen, and one in France as Oxfam France, with also a coalition of other NGOs. And so I totally agree that we need to push for more representative from civil society on the working groups with the French presidency, that's for sure. And also, so what we understood is that the French waited for a long time for India to jump in, and so to co-construct this summit with them. And so that's why they tell us that it took time. And for example, the Indian co-presidency hasn't sent their concept note for the summit so far. So they are also waiting for this to get more guidance on what they can expect from the summit. But I agree on what Federica said about the quick wins that they expect, which are more reachable, which are of course this maybe this SDR reallocation on some with some countries. Also those natural disaster and pandemic clauses. These are the quick wins that they are hoping. I think concerning the other expectations, I think they are not very clear on what they can get, and it will depend a lot, I think, on India and other countries. And so I think they are banking a lot on the spring meetings also to see whether they can gain traction on the different issues they want to push, and it can also be an opportunity to, I mean, if they don't reach their objectives at the spring meetings, then maybe they will try to push more after that. But I think, yeah, they count on spring meetings to show the way, to pave the way for example, on the reform of GFIs. I think they will wait and see, and after that they already said that the Paris summit could be also a moment for some sort of a guidance for the new World Bank president, so to contribute to the mandate for his following years. So yeah, so what I can say that I think they are not so clear about what they can hope from the Paris summit, but at least they said that they will bank on the coalitions of the willing if they don't manage to get consensus on multilateral instances. Over.
Great, thanks for that input there. I think we were last sort of 4 minutes of the call looking to move to next steps, and Sophie has pointed out, is there's plans to coordinate with the global civil society on this. But moving to next steps, do you want to go over sort of you had a slide there on next steps, just reiterate those again, please, Federica, and how we're going to sort of engage with the wider global community?
Yes. So, okay, here we go. Yeah, so this is actually just like the first step, right? We really want to work together in a broad coalition, and ideally also with Global South partners. So one is, we already put up a WhatsApp group that we will share. We will use, for intel sharing, but also to coordinate actions, like member actions, sign-on letters, and so on. There is one policy brief that we've worked on with a couple of NGOs and think tanks, including Oxfam, you just heard, that is open for signature. And it's actually, I mean, we needed something to go back to the French government quite quickly in making clear what our expectations were. But we will actually revise this as we go. So update this from time to time, and then obviously go back to all the signatories. And I think, I know that there are already other sign-on policy briefs that we can make sure to share with you, especially through the Google Drive that we set up. Then, as I said, partners of ours have already set up regional calls. Again, we can share here the different focal points so that you can get in touch with them. And then Cal also suggested to create actually a Google email list. So keeping each other posted over email. Cal, I think these were the ideas we had, right? Oh, and the other thing being that we can obviously reorganize such a briefing. We thought maybe in 6 weeks' time or so, but if needed, we're happy to organize it sooner. I mean, we set this one up very quickly, or also on more specific issues if people felt that this was useful. And last but not least, my colleague Nicola also shared this, is that at this moment, I was very much focused on Inter sharing advocacy around the Paris Summit. But at Global Citizen, we will also launch a campaign and will obviously keep you posted on our plans as we want to work with a broad range of partners on this.
Yeah,
Thank
exactly.
you.
So I suggest that perhaps as this group comes and takes a look at the overall picture, perhaps 6 weeks, looking maybe just the week after the World Bank spring meetings, when that will hopefully have, you know, France will know better what the appetite is from other donor governments. And as Federica said, I will be sending an email to all the participants, and that'll be the link to the recording, and then it'll give you next steps to get engaged to the level that you want to be engaged, whether or not you join a regional group, the WhatsApp group, or join Google email list. And then we can also have, using the Google email list, decide whether or not there's a specific conversation that needs to happen around, you know, getting Global South partners involved, or a particular issue that people would want to sort of have another briefing on. The WhatsApp group has not been shared. It'll be shared by email. It'll come out to you in the next couple of days as a wrap up to this call. I think that's time, and I think that wraps things up. Anything else, Federica, you want to point out or say?
Just saying thank you and looking forward to working with all of you.
Great. Well, thank you for your time, Federica, for making this possible. Thanks to Global Citizens for making it happen, and to people who are working behind the scenes to make this, all the chat go smoothly. Thanks everyone for taking the time over your busy lives for this call. We'll be in touch by email in the next couple of days with next steps and follow up. But in the meantime, good advocacy and keep on pushing. Thanks a lot.
Thank you. Bye-bye.